So podcasts. Podcasts look very different today than when you started the show. How many years ago?
12.
12 years ago. When you were getting into podcasting, there was maybe 1/20th, 1/50th, 1/100th of the number of shows. Last count I checked was 4.5 million podcasts that exist. So as people in the audience are thinking about their companies creating podcasts or launching podcasts themselves, when do you think it makes sense to actually launch a podcast?
So first off, there may be 4.5 million podcasts that actually exist, but active podcasts, meaning one that have actually published an episode in the past 30 to 60 days, is a fraction of that. So active podcasts is actually a very small number compared to the overall dead faded podcasts, because over the years, everybody thinks it's a good idea to start a podcast, which it is, but then when they get into the meat and potatoes of it, they realize the work that is involved with creating a meaningful, good value-add podcast is really difficult. They fade, and that's okay. But we're gonna be talking today about how you can start a podcast or recommend your company or business to start a podcast to avoid that inevitable pod fading that happens and be one of those podcasts that is actually continuing to be consistently producing the right content over time to serve your audience in a meaningful way. And that's what we're talking about here today. So within that, what do you want to dive into?
Yeah, so I think something that's very interesting, maybe a contrarian view that you have, even though you do an interview show yourself, is you don't think an interview show is the right type of podcast for most companies or new podcasts that are launching. Can you talk about why that is? And if that is the case, if a company is thinking about launching a podcast and one that isn't dog shit and isn't just like marketing, that feels not like actually value add content, where do you start to create a great content?
So it might be kind of crazy to say like, wow, the daily interview guy that's been doing this for 12 years, over 4,400 episodes, is saying that interview podcasts are a bad idea for most people and for most businesses. But that is what I'm saying, and I actually have the data to back it up, because we've been running Podcasters Paradise, which is the biggest podcasting course and community in the world, for 10 years now. So we see the podcasters, we see the data, we see the individuals and the shows that actually work, and we see the ones that don't work. Now, a lot of people in businesses specifically will not start podcasts because they know the effort that goes into doing an interview-based podcast, and so they stay away. And rightfully so, by the way, because it is an unbelievable amount of work. Those people that start interview shows, for the most part, have no idea of the work that goes into an interview-based show. It's called finding the right guest for your show, coldly reaching out to that guest, having them somehow respond to you, somehow coordinating a scheduling time to have that interview. Then once you have that interview, them not showing up, or them showing up with bad audio quality. And then if you make it through all of that and somehow you're doing the interview, there's background noise, there's dogs barking, there's babies crying, there's audio interruptions and all these different things. And guess what? You then have to edit that whole interview, and then you're done finally, and that's one interview. And you're like, I've got to do that again and again if I'm doing a weekly show, multiple days per week, even a couple per month. That is so much work. And that's why everybody, not everybody, but a vast majority of individuals who start an interview show end up pod fading because they can't keep it up on a consistent basis, and they never get to that inflection point that takes time to get there. Now, the shows that actually work, and the ones that if I were you, I'd be pitching to my company, to my business, or to myself, is, hey, let me sit down, let me get to know who my perfect customer, clients are. What are their biggest struggles, their biggest challenges, their biggest obstacles? And by the way, you probably have all this data or can quickly attain it. And then you have, let's say, the top 50 obstacles, challenges, and struggles that your audience has, that your perfect customers have, that your ideal clients have. And then what? Then you have 50 podcast episodes of you and a microphone, or somebody in your company and a microphone sitting there and creating 3, 5, or 10-minute podcast episodes individually, giving the solution to that problem that your specific client has. All of that stuff that I said to do one podcast interview goes away. You can then record 10, 20, 30 of those 5 to 10 minute podcast episodes in a day. in a couple days, in a block of hours, and now you have months of content going out on a multi-day per week or once per week basis, and now you have a real show that's going forward and it's meaningful and it's actually addressing the problems and obstacles and challenges that your ideal customers have. And I hate to say it too, on that interview thing, when you're bringing in that guest that's the expert, they're probably gonna give some great content, but then where's your listener gonna go? To them, to their solutions. And it's probably not your company's solutions or your products or your services. So why are you building a platform to send people to somebody else if you bring them in? Now, there are occasions when you can have an occasional guest, and we'll talk about that later with Alex, but for the most part, a topic-based podcast, a Q&A podcast, a problems and solutions podcast is the way to go for all the reasons I just broke down.
I want to go a little bit deeper there because I agree with you. Like, the place to start is effectively defining who's your marketer of one or who's your customer, what are their problems, how are you going to basically solve their problems through the content of the podcast. But if I think about your show, right, you are helping entrepreneurs solve problems by having guests on the show who have levels of expertise around something that solves specific problems for entrepreneurs. I don't believe that anyone on planet Earth could go start the show that you have, in the sense of, one, it's a logistical nightmare, as you alluded to, and you figured out a process. But also, there is something about the way in which you deliver the content, the way in which you interview the guests, right? Like, your showmanship and your personality are a big part of why the show is valuable, right? It's not just the content, it's the voice in which the content is delivered. So for a company who's trying to create a show, maybe they don't have someone who has content creation experience, how do you avoid a show just falling flat? Because you can still deliver solutions to problems, but it still could feel dry as hell and doesn't keep people's attention.
Absolutely. Listen, this is a great question because for me, I would never start Entrepreneurs on Fire ever, and I mean ever, in 2024. I launched my show at the right time. That's just lucky for me, for sure. And I would never launch that show again in that manner because it just was the right time for me.
Yeah, but I'm curious, as you think about anyone in the crowd deciding whether they want to launch a podcast, what would make you say a company shouldn't launch a podcast? Or said differently, what should make them want to launch a podcast?
So I want to start with the latter because I like the positive attitude of like, why should you want to launch a podcast? You should want to launch a podcast if you and or your company truly believe that you have the number one solution to a real problem that you can solve. And that's such a key format for podcasters to be thinking about, is like, it's a very saturated market we live in. It's always been saturated. It always will be saturated in the future. We're always going to hear that. 10 years from now, we'll be sitting at a conference. They'll talk about how saturated the market is. 10 years ago, I was sitting at a conference like this talking about how saturated podcasting was. Those are just words. What the reality is, you need to create the number one solution to a real problem and just focus on that, because people and individuals and customers and clients will beat a path to the doorstep of the number one solution to a real problem, keywords, real problem, and they will ignore the second best solution to infinity. So when you're creating an idea, a concept to create any kind of content, podcast, fill in the blank, we'll be talking about newsletters later, you have to say, am I going to be the number one solution to this real problem? If not, that's okay. Niche down, and then niche down again until you can be that one amazing solution to a real individual problem. So if rewind 12 years ago, I was coming up with a concept for Entrepreneurs on Fire. What did I say? I want to start a business podcast. Okay, at the time, let's say there was 800 business podcasts. Niche down, I want to interview entrepreneurs. There was let's say 25 business podcasts that were interviewing entrepreneurs. And I said, how can I be different? How can I be the number one solution to a real problem? I had to niche down again because I was not going to be number one of those 25. So I said, what's the differentiator? For me, it was quantity. Nobody was doing a daily show interviewing entrepreneurs. People were doing it once a week, twice a month. I was an individual who wanted to consume a podcast 7 days a week because I was driving to work every day. I was at the gym. I was walking my dog. I had so much time to consume content, but the content that I wanted didn't exist, that was free, that was on demand, and that was specifically targeted. I wanted to listen to business interviews of successful entrepreneurs. I knew that I could learn from that, and I could apply that to my own business journey. That was going to be such a key part for what I wanted to do. And so I said, Everybody's doing it once a week. What if I did it twice a week? Okay, that would differentiate me. What if I did it 3 times? And you can see where I went with that. I said, I'm going to be the only daily podcast interviewing the world's most successful entrepreneurs, literally 7 days a week. And so the day that I launched, Entrepreneurs on Fire was the best daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs. It was the worst daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs. It was the only daily podcast interviewing the world's most successful entrepreneurs. I was it. I was the only game in town for that. For the individual that wanted that kind of content on that kind of quantity, you had to come to my show, whether you liked me, my guests, whatever it might be. That was the only show in town. So how can you take that mentality and apply it to something that you want to create, niching down until potentially it hurts because you think it's maybe too niche, maybe too narrow, maybe not a big enough audience? I can guarantee you you're wrong, because if there's any audience there, you can dominate that niche. You can get to that inflection point, that traction that so few podcasts, content creators, YouTube channels ever get to. And from that point, you can start to expand out, broaden out a little bit as you capture more market and bring your audience with you.
So I want to talk about 2 things you mentioned, because I think they're so true of actually what makes the most successful podcast successful today. So the first is barriers and the second is niches. So I want to talk about both. With barriers, you think about what you've pulled off, and it's kind of like a miraculous feat. You don't have a massive team, right? It's you, your wife, and like amazing systems, right?
2 VAs.
And 2 VAs. And you've been able to basically, for the last 12 years, source 7 guests a week, 7 high quality guests a week, like deal with all of the bullshit you have to deal with sound quality, people not showing up, all these things. And when I think about 2 shows that have grown immensely in the last 2 years, there's 2 shows that come to mind, and I'm curious if folks have heard them. The first is called Founders. Raise your hand if you've heard of Founders, the podcast. Okay, so we got like 20%, not bad, I'll tell David. So Founders, the entire premise of Founders is David Senra decided like 3 or 4 years ago he was going to read the biographies of the most successful business people, the most successful world leaders, like the most successful leaders in society. He was going to read them. He was going to take copious notes, and he was going to do hour to hour and a half long podcast episodes where he effectively does a deep dive into the book so you don't have to read the book. He has done that once a week, twice a week, for 4 years straight. The show is absolutely crushing it now, but if you think of the barriers to entry, like if you want to compete with David, he's like, by all means, come try and do what I've been doing for the last 4 years, and I welcome your success also because it's so incredibly difficult. Second show I'm going to mention is Acquired. Raise your hand if you've heard of Acquired. Okay, similar number.
Surprising.
So Acquired, basically co-hosted show, 2 best friends. They basically take the most successful companies in society, LVMH, NVIDIA, and they learn everything about the companies, and then they do 4-hour-long deep dive conversations so you can learn the history of the business, the fundamentals of the business, what makes it so successful, etc. Think about how much work. These guys read 3 to 4 books before they do a deep dive into every company. The amount of just pure grit to create their podcast has created an unbelievable barrier. So as you think about launching a podcast, one, simply existing for a long time is a barrier. As you know, John and I were talking about before, so many podcasts start, but they don't continue. So continuing ends up being a barrier. But putting a lot of work into whatever your podcast is and asking yourself, how hard would it be for someone else to replicate it, is an amazing barrier for success as well. The second thing I want to talk about is niches. You know, we were talking about this before, Tim Ferriss. Who knows Tim Ferriss, out of curiosity? Okay. Tim's still big, I guess. That's awesome. He's the best. And he wrote a blog post the other day where basically he took a 6-week sabbatical from his podcast. He was only publishing old episodes. And it was for him to think about the future of his podcast because he's been podcasting for a long time. He's seen that growth has started to slow for his show. He's one of the first interview shows that was out there. And he basically came to the conclusion there's 3 ways that he can succeed in podcasting today. The first is that he has to niche down significantly. Basically, his view is if you look at the fastest growing shows in podcasting today, it's people who have weird, super niche, interesting obsessions, and they go all the way down in that obsession. He decided for himself that he wasn't going to get a lot of enjoyment from that. So he's like, okay, the second option is I quit the podcast. He actually was considering quitting his show that is basically his whole livelihood. And the third was, I somehow need to make my interview show novel and do it differently. And the conclusion he came to is he's going to follow a 90-10 rule for his interview podcast. 90% of the guests that he interviews, you will have never heard of. They're going to be academics, researchers, scientists that he believes the world needs to know, but have never appeared on a podcast before. 10% are going to be A-list names. And he also made a hard and fast rule that he will not interview anyone who's doing a book tour ever again. And so I think there's a few interesting takeaways based on what you described, which is there's so much value in the niches, and especially if you're creating a company podcast, it makes sense to go super niche and not go super wide, because at the end of the day, you want it to be value add to ultimately the person down the road who's going to be paying you for your product. And the second is, if you're not niche, you have to be novel. You have to develop a format or a new way of delivering your podcast that doesn't exist today. Any other thoughts just on that?
I mean, just to double down on that, like it's going to be so key for a business that's going to create a podcast for other businesses or for their customers and clients to be really focused on that really big struggle that they're having, so that you can have that conversation with them on the phone, via email, wherever that might be. And you can say, and oh, by the way, we actually did a deep dive on this topic. Here's a link to our podcast. It's very well crafted. In 5 to 10 to however long, 15 minutes, we really dive deep into this content if you want to learn more. So that an individual can then take that conversation they were having with you via email, on the phone, wherever it might be, and then maybe go on a walk, and then maybe put the earbuds in their ear and listen to an in-depth, more kind of topics around that point, that struggle that they're having, and get to know other people in the business. Get to know, maybe it's you that recorded it even more intimately, and now it's not like this kind of one-on-one conversation that they're kind of like trying to react to, but it's just this kind of casual but intimate listening of that voice of that individual, and they're getting more knowledge, more value. They're getting to know exactly who this person is, who this company is, what their values are, and it's just that other touch point, that other selling point. I mean, anybody in advertising knows it usually takes between 7 to 10 touch points to really make a sale, especially if it's a big time sale. That's why the big companies are everywhere. Billboards, commercials, social media, etc. And so all these different touch points put you one step closer, and by the way, differentiate you from your competitors, and is planting seeds for, if it's not right now, guess what? You're having a conversation with that individual, for that customer, that client. It might not be the right time for them right now to pull the trigger, and they just kind of go away, and they may forget about you, and then 3 months, 6 months, 6 years from now, the problem comes up and they want to pull the trigger. If you were able to maybe get them to subscribe to a podcast that you're continuously delivering to them on this subscription basis that they're just consuming for free, you're going to stay top of mind. You're going to be there, and it's very meaningful. And I always refer back to this conversation with the Mercedes CEO. He said, you know what? We actually market intentionally to 10-year-olds, to 12-year-olds, to 14-year-olds. And that might sound weird because they don't even have a license. But I don't expect them to buy a Mercedes because they can't, and they can't even drive. 30 years from now, 40 years from now, when they're in their 50s, their 60s, and they want to buy a luxury car, I want them to have been thinking about Mercedes this whole time, because I planted a seed now that will grow. And I'm not saying you should be looking at a 30-year time frame for yourself or your business, but you get the idea and the concept that this is a way for you to stay connected, engaged, add more value for free to your customers, to your clients.
Yeah, and I think such a big point that you mentioned there is, when I think about every media channel that exists, like the full stack, and we can talk about this in a few minutes, but like basically the way that I break down media channels in general is you have rented audience, owned audience, and monetized audience. For folks in the crowd who have a company, your monetized audience is basically ultimately the people who consume your content, that buy your product, whether it's software or service, etc. Rented audience is social media, owned audience is email, podcasting, and communities. And it's a good way to think about how have you stacked kind of your media in the right way to get the benefits from all of these different types of audience. But the thing I'll say about podcasting is it is the most intimate channel to build an audience, period. I haven't published my podcast that I was creating for 3 years straight. I haven't published it in 6 months. And I still hear more from the listeners of my podcast than any other channel that I create on the internet. Not only asking me when I'm going to be publishing my podcast again, but also like inquiries for opportunity in terms of launching businesses, employees for businesses, people who want to do consulting things. Like, I hear more from my podcast listeners, even though I don't publish the podcast anymore.
Can I jump on that real quick? So this is such an important point that he's making, because even at this event right here, I've had people that have walked up to me and they said, John, I've been listening to Entrepreneurs on Fire for 12 years, for 12 months, for 5 episodes, whatever it might be. They've been consuming Entrepreneurs on Fire, and they say, this is going to sound a little weird, but I kind of feel like we're friends because I know your personality. I listen to your show as I'm walking my dog, as I'm driving to work, as I'm folding laundry. And I always reply back, I'm like, it's not weird because I feel that way about the hosts of the shows that I listen to, because it is this like one-on-one almost, when you're just no longer this fly in the wall, but you are just having this amazing, like, it's a one-sided conversation, of course, but you're listening to this individual, getting to know their personality, and in a lot of ways you're feeling like you are interacting with them. And this is one thing about kind of breaking down that fourth wall that I always try to do in my show. I always refer to my audience, my listeners, as Fire Nation, because I want them to know that during this episode, during this interview that I'm having with an individual, I'm doing it for my audience, for my listeners, for Fire Nation. The questions that I'm asking, the value that I'm trying to extract from my guests is for Fire Nation, is for my audience. And so I will literally turn, both literally and figuratively, while I'm interviewing somebody, to the microphone, and I will no longer be like looking at Alex, and I'll be saying, so Fire Nation, what Alex just said was so good, was so smart, and I really want you to take away from these points. And I really hope you're thinking about these points. And by the way, if this is bringing up something for you as my listener that you think is interesting, I'd love to hear from you via email, via social media. Interact with me. And then I kind of turn back, all right, Alex, so off to the next topic. But so like that person's walking along the beach, and now they're just like, wow, I kind of feel like I had this moment where the host was including me, was engaging with me. And I always love those moments as a listener. So I always bring those moments in my podcast as a host. And that's one thing that I really want to encourage, especially when you're going to be launching a B2B business podcast or even a B2C podcast, whatever it might be, the podcast you're going to create. How do you dominate the niche? And because you're going to be in that narrow niche, realize you're speaking to a specific individual. You can really and meaningfully speak to that person like you know them, because you're probably going to be right about a lot of what you're talking about when it comes to them, because you know them. You're creating your show for them, that number one solution to their real problem.
I love that. And, you know, basically what you've described, I think of it as like this really deep parasocial relationship. And what's cool about how you described it is like you can play it on easy mode and you can play it on hard mode. Easy mode is you just create a podcast, and podcast as a channel by nature is going to create a greater parasocial relationship than other channels on the internet. But then you can play it on hard mode, which is kind of like the technical skills that you just described, which is you can actually do things as a host and from a production perspective to make the parasocial relationship even deeper. I want to talk now about growing a podcast, because, you know, we've talked about content, how to think about content strategy, why there's value in niches or novelty, but growing a podcast is incredibly difficult. Discoverability is dog shit. People don't know how to grow a show, other than I feel like the tried and true method for people was create good content, do it for 12 years, and it'll grow. How do you think about growing a podcast today, given it is so difficult?
So back when I said that I would not launch Entrepreneurs on Fire in 2012, I really wouldn't, because that kind of show that I created and built for 12 years would have a lot harder time getting product market fits in 2024 and beyond for a lot of reasons. So when I look at like, how do you grow a show today in today's market? Listen, we're here for a reason. HubSpot is awesome. Inbound is awesome. Like when HubSpot approached me in 2021 and say, we're creating a podcast network for similar podcasts to bring them together and to promote each other, I said, heck yes, sign me up, because I don't want to be in a silo. I don't want to be an individual in a silo just trying to grow my show in an echo chamber. And so they brought together amazing podcast hosts that we're all like-minded, we all have similar audiences, and now what do we do? On my show, in the pre-roll, I'm promoting other podcasters. I'm promoting like-minded podcasters, and they're doing the same for me.
Yeah, I love that. So there's a few things I'll say here. A general kind of timeless lesson in media that I found is whether you have a newsletter, whether you have a podcast, whether you have a YouTube channel, when you do like channel cross promotion, it always works better. So just like John was talking about how there's cross promotion with other creators in the HubSpot Creator Network, or at Morning Brew, when I think about the best acquisition channels for new subscribers we've ever had, it's always been with basically high engagement newsletters that have complementary content but a similar audience to ours. So as you think about launching content within your business and you think about growth for it, like channel cross promotion can be a big thing. The second thing I'll say here is I give HubSpot so much credit for developing the Creator Network because one, I haven't seen any other B2B or really B2C companies do it. The other reason is because it takes such a long-term outlook, because I think the issue that a lot of B2B companies have with thinking about their company as a media company, creating content franchises, is the connection between creating content and actually driving revenue. Attribution is incredibly difficult. But almost going back to the point that John was saying about the Mercedes-Benz CEO selling to an audience who's going to buy in 30 years, if you are only thinking about down funnel content like SEO or anything that basically sits lower funnel, what happens when the audience who is ready to buy today has bought and you haven't been nurturing anyone else out there who may be primed to buy your product a year, 18 months, 24 months from now? You're going to be shit out of luck. And so from my perspective, building a media company on top of your software business, B2B company, is simply just building up a top of funnel who are going to be lower funnel, 12, 18 months from now. And so I just think there's so much opportunity if companies are willing to take creative risk and also, let's call it some attribution risk. There's so many opportunities to build mini HubSpot creator networks that are a combination of shows you launch internally. But let's just say you've listened to John and you're like, damn, that sounds hard as hell. I don't know how we're going to do that in our company. There are probably already creators in your niche that are creating amazing content that you can find ways to partner with. So I'll just give you an example. I was talking at a marketing offsite for Carve, which is the cap table management software business, the other day. And one of their marketing folks was like, we're focusing a ton right now on getting in front of private equity CFOs, very specific, very niche. And I was literally, God, I'm so in the TikTok culture. I'm like, I said very niche, and I was like, very demure. God, what am I doing with my life? And he was like, I'm a marketer. I don't know a ton about FP&A, strategic finance, like what CFOs care about. How can I try to create a newsletter or a podcast for that audience? What I said to him is either you need to have a subject matter expert within your business that you hire to do that, or, and I told him, I was like, there's literally a guy on Twitter whose his handle is Secret CFO. He is a CFO of a multi-billion-dollar company who creates content on the side. He has a newsletter audience of 200,000 subscribers. 75% of them are CFOs. Why don't you just buy him? Or why don't you just partner with him in some way? And so I think there's just not nearly enough creativity in businesses partnering with great creators who are already owning the niches that you want to own. And it's kind of this buy versus build strategy. Okay, so we've talked about growth. Any other thoughts for the audience in terms of they're thinking about launching a podcast? We've talked about content strategy. We've talked about growth of the channel. Oh, the other thing we didn't mention is YouTube. And I know you have some thoughts on if you think there's opportunity with YouTube. I would say YouTube is the other big opportunity for podcast growth. When I think of most podcasters I know, and John has been able to, I think, do an unbelievable job of growing his show even without YouTube. But I would say most shows today that launch, they rely on it being a video podcast from day one. Because like we were saying before, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, discoverability is really bad and sharing of podcasts is really clunky. With YouTube, it's built on the largest search engine in the world. And there are so many podcasts I know who are actually growing their listenership and their views way faster by posting all of their episodes on YouTube versus in the audio-only format. So to give an example, another show in the HubSpot Creator Network is My First Million. My First Million is growing way faster in their YouTube format right now versus their audio-only format. And so I think while there's a lot more work that has to be done up front to launch a video and audio podcast, it just stacks the deck in your favor from a distribution perspective if you're willing to do that upfront work.
Listen, YouTube is where it's at. It is where so many people are consuming so much content every single day. There as a platform just going from strength to strength. It is a requirement if you're going to be producing content in a video and audio format to be focusing on YouTube today. Of course, the podcast channels like Apple, Spotify, Pandora, no-brainers as well. But YouTube is amazing. But again, it goes back to if you can create that number one solution to a real problem, then you have a chance of being found for that on YouTube. But if you're going to be, just Mr. or Mrs. Generic and trying to just be everything to everyone, then you're going to have a ton of competition of people that are doing it unbelievably well, especially in YouTube, as in everything that you're doing. I'm just going to say, this is what I'm going to be known for. This is what I'm going to dominate. This is the focus of what I'm going to crush with the content that I create, with the solutions that I provide. So YouTube, all the way, it's critical. It just has to be done with that mindset.
One more example on that note about just the value of niches in YouTube and just in general across media platforms, and then you want to talk newsletters after that?
Yes.
This is going to be a fun one. Show of hands, who has heard of epic gardening? One,
She
two.
loves it though, but you love it, right?
Loves epic gardening. Who's the other hand over there? Do you like epic gardening? By the way, that is the perfect answer. I would actually have been extremely concerned if 20% of the audience raised their hands. One, it would make me look like an idiot in giving my example of a niche audience because it wouldn't be very niche. But you look at epic gardening. Started by Kevin Espiritu as a blog. It has a YouTube channel now with 3-point-something million subscribers. The business does $75 million a year, half through brand partnerships, half from selling seeds, like literal seeds. He acquired a seed company a few years ago. That is half the revenue of the business. And so I just think as the internet becomes more fragmented, as creating content, the cost of creating content approaches zero and the risk of creating content approaches zero, the long tail of needs and passions and things that people treat like religion in their life and in work, you're just going to have this long tail of niches. And what you learn is every niche ends up being way bigger than you think it is at first.
And by the way, if you're sitting back there and saying, well, my business or my company or myself, I provide a lot of solutions to a lot of problems, that's great. And there's nothing wrong with that by any way, shape, or form. But how are people going to first find you? And they're going to find you by actually wedging in to that number one solution to a real problem. They're saying, wow, Alex really provided so much value on this specific problem challenge that I had. What else does he talk about? What are some other things that he provides? Now I know him. Now I like him. Now I trust him because I've seen his face. I've heard his voice. He's actually helped me. Now they may take a deep dive and explore other things that you have. And that's when you say, well, my business, my company actually does provide a suite of options, a suite of opportunities, a suite of solutions. And now your foot's in that door.
Love that. Let's talk newsletters.
Newsletters.
Let's do it.
How many people in the last week have been in their email and read a newsletter of some kinds? Raise your hands. See, this is the biggest response. I mean, it's literally close to 100%.
I will say I'm actually a little surprised, even though I've been in the newsletter space for 10 years. Like, newsletters go through cycles of people saying newsletters dead. And then, so I'm like, oh, maybe I'm 10 years into this. Maybe people are reading newsletters less. And maybe, again, it's a specific demographic of early, mid, late career professionals here. But it's crazy to me. It's like 90%.
It's like 90%, and I'm not surprised at all, unlike you, because for me, my day begins and ends, and a lot of it in the middle is with going to my inbox and communicating there and seeing there. And generic newsletters are dead, boring newsletters are dead, bad newsletters are dead, but specific intentional newsletters are on fire, and they will be and should be for the foreseeable future. Whenever I'm a massive college basketball fan. I went to college locally here in Providence, Rhode Island, Providence College Friars, love it. I am obsessed with getting a newsletter from a specific reporter who only reports on Providence College, the recruits, the upcoming season, the current team, interviews with the coach. When that newsletter comes in, everything in my day goes away, and I just read that entirely. Watch all the videos, click on all the links, and I love it. If a week goes by and I haven't got one of those, I'm upset because I love consuming that content. I'm passionate about it. It's a specific niche. It's one college basketball team in the entire country, but it's my college basketball team, and I love it. And so how are you creating that content for your audience where they will consume it in a newsletter? So back to you.
So yeah, I think I'm going to say something a little spicy, and then I will help with solving the spicy problem. You know, a lot of people come to me and they say, do you think that there's still opportunity in newsletters? There's more newsletters than ever before. My inbox is cluttered more than ever before. What I generally say is I think of newsletters a lot like I think of podcasts, which is you have a certain number of slots. That number of slots is not changing. There are more newsletters than ever before. But what I'll also say is like most newsletters really are dog shit. Like I don't know how else to say it. Like most of them are really bad. And I'll explain why I think they're bad in a second.
Let me jump in real quick. So keep that in my line of thought.
Yep.
There are more newsletters than before, but also way before, we, as the receivers of these newsletters, had no way of filtering them. Now there's unsubscribe, there's filtering options with Gmail. Gmail's, and other newsletter and other email providers as well are doing their own form of spam filtering, all these different things. So like my actual inbox is unbelievably clean opposed to what it was 5 and 10 years ago because of the opportunities that I have to keep it that way. So even though there's more than ever before, I don't get spam. Like I don't get crap.
Totally.
I get what I want.
Yeah, and so I think, look, you have those 5 slots. If you have a newsletter, you are competing for one of someone's 4 or 5 slots. My general view is say there's like 2 or 3 slots that a newsletter subscriber has that they're ride or die with that newsletter. They're going to stay with it for a while. So there's probably 2 slots and you're trying to win over one of them. I generally think most newsletters are bad today for 2 reasons. One is what happens, I think, in any like market with content or just businesses is when there's monetary opportunity, people flood into it to make money. And so what happened was with Morning Brew selling, with the Hustle selling, with there being a number of email newsletter acquisitions, people for the first time saw, oh, wait, I can start an email newsletter, I can work on it for a few years, and then I can sell the thing. And also the barrier to create a newsletter has never been lower because you have Substack, you have ConvertKit, you have Beehive, et cetera. And so what this just means to me is there's like this messy middle of a lot of short-term opportunism of people creating newsletters simply for the purpose of flipping them in a year or two, but it does not mean that they are great newsletters. So it's like they exist, but they're not great. I think the second thing from a company's point of view is I still do not understand why most companies do not have a great destination newsletter. And I'll explain the differences. There's 2 types of newsletters: destination newsletter and marketing newsletter. Marketing newsletter is historically what companies have thought about when they think about their email and how they handle email at their company. Marketing newsletter simply exists for the purpose of getting someone to leave the newsletter as quickly as possible to end up at some other destination, whether it's your website, whether it's a lead magnet, whether it's a white paper, whatever. Just think about how horrible of an experience that is. A customer has signed up for your newsletter, they've opted in to get value from you, and within 30 seconds, you're trying to send them away to get value somewhere else, or really extract value from them. The other type is a destination newsletter. And I cannot claim that Morning Brew was the first destination newsletter. Back like 10 years ago, there was Daily Candy, and there were a few early destination newsletters. The Skim started before us, and then it was like Morning Brew, The Hustle, et cetera. And a destination newsletter, very simply, is the newsletter is the product. We want to get someone to read our newsletter top to bottom or top to until they get enough value. We don't expect them to click away and go somewhere else. This is the destination, and this is where you need to stay to get the value. And I have not seen nearly enough companies treat their newsletter as a destination to build up top of funnel, to nurture their audience, and then to natively and subtly promote their products maybe 10 to 20% of the time. But my view is most companies would be way better off creating the perfect newsletter for the professional that's in their industry and make it the indispensable tool to help that professional do better in their career. And just by association of the company being the creator of that newsletter, you will get so many loyal customers. But I think companies are afraid to take a risk of moving from pure marketing newsletter that tries to extract value as quickly as possible to more of the slow sell and creating a destination newsletter.
So if people are listening right now and they're kind of saying, I need to do a makeover of my current company's newsletter, my business's newsletter, my own personal newsletter, or I want to start a newsletter, what would be your recommended process?
So I think we were talking about this before, but it all starts with market of one, right? So who is the one person that this newsletter is created for? I think this is particularly difficult for some businesses that have many profiles of customer, because you're like, well, if I have 5 different types of customer, who do I write for? My answer would be definitely do not write for all of 5, because you will write for none of them. I would say pick your most important customer that also you think from a content perspective you can add the most value to. So the first is, who is your market of one? The second is, what is your problem statement? So I'll give the example for Morning Brew. The problem statement for Morning Brew is that Aaron, the 28-year-old who works in private equity, lives in Connecticut, goes to New York, watches TED Talks. He wants to stay on top of the business world, and he wants to have smart conversations with his boss and not come off dumb when he talks to his boss at work and he hypothetically doesn't know something that his boss expected him to know. And Aaron spends all day focusing on deals and in spreadsheets, working on private equity stuff, whatever they work on, and he doesn't keep up to date with what's just happening broadly in the business world. That is the problem he's experiencing. So you have to figure out for your audience, what is that specific problem? And I generally think there's like 5 problems that have been proven to, if you fix one of them or several of them in the newsletter space, you can build a great newsletter. You either need to save someone time, save them embarrassment, make them money, save them money, or provide analysis, provide a way of thinking that they would have never otherwise seen. And I can give examples of successful newsletters that have done each one of these things. So you have the problem, then you have the solution statement. The solution for Morning Brew is we want to help Aaron prevent himself from being caught off guard in a conversation with his boss by giving him the most important stories in the business world in 5 minutes in a way that feels like he's talking to his conversational best friend, right? Market of one, problem, solution. The next step is setting up your content strategy. And I basically think like you can play the newsletter game, again, going back to easy mode and hard mode, on easy mode or hard mode. If you study the most successful newsletters over the last 5 years, there's a generally formulaic approach to like the types of content that goes in newsletters. Just to give a few examples, there's news-focused content, there's analysis of important stories, there's evergreen tools and strategies, there's news-adjacent stuff, there's games, there's list of links of things you should know about but we couldn't cover in depth in the newsletter. So there's a lot of, if you just study Morning Brew, The Hustle, The Skim, and like 3 or 4 of the other big newsletters, you'll start to see these patterns and the type of topics they cover. Hard mode is you basically attempt creatively to solve the problem for your market of one in a new and innovative way. So I'll give an example of 3 newsletters that to me are playing on hard mode because I haven't seen anyone do what they're doing before them. The first is called Smart Nonsense. Smart Nonsense was created by buddies of mine. And basically what it is they took the comic strip and they brought it to a newsletter. And so what their newsletter is it's for the intellectually curious who wants to understand how things work in the world. Basically, they understand how things work in a cartoon format. So say someone is intellectually curious about how thunderstorms and lightning works, through their cartoon in 3 minutes, you can understand it. It's almost like how stuff works, the TV show or the podcast, they did it in newsletter form. The second one is called Marketing Examined. Talk about being niche. This guy, Alex Garcia, his market of one is a mid-level content marketer at a B2B SaaS company. I guess I'm natively plugging his newsletter for the group. He basically took Harvard Business Review, which does case studies into current companies and basically what are the strategies they use to be successful. He does that for contemporary companies and what are the content strategies that they're leveraging to be successful with their business. And it is a very visual newsletter that kind of demonstrates these case studies, but in a not text-heavy way. The third newsletter is called 5 Tweet Tuesday. It's by my buddy Sean Purry, who also hosts My First Million. And that is the definition of a newsletter that succeeds because of curation. Curation has never been more valuable because we were just talking about how there's more content on the internet, in podcasts, YouTube than ever before, which means search cost is going up. For anyone in this audience to try to find a new show they like, it takes a shit ton of time. And so what Sean basically decided is finding the content on Twitter that you really like is going to take a while. So I'm going to curate the 5 best tweets that I find in a week. So I will take on the brunt of spending time to find these tweets, and I'll do 2 to 3 sentences to contextualize them and add some of my color. By the way, I think smart curation, like he's doing it in the niche of Twitter, it can be done in so many other contexts as well. So just kind of going down the list quickly, it's market of one, problem, solution, content strategy. Are you playing it on easy mode or you're playing on hard mode? And then again, in terms of execution of the newsletter, my general view is if you have a 5-day-a-week newsletter, you're going to need 2 writers who kind of pinch hit as editors. If you're doing a once-a-week newsletter, depending on the depth of the newsletter, it has to be close to 1 full-time person's job.
Who would you say is the second best newsletter to your newsletter?
Thank you for asking that way.
Well, can I answer the question for
Yeah.
you? There is no second best. And that's kind of like a Michael Saylor quote. There is no second best. And that's such a key thing to remember is somebody that's subscribing and reading Alex's newsletter on a day-to-day basis, that's what they're consuming. They're not consuming a second one on top of that because his newsletter is providing what they need, then they're moving on with their day. There is no second best. So you need to be focused on not being second best to infinity, and don't let that scare you because it's not scary because the reality is this. You can become the best within that niche in whatever vertical you want to go into. You can just say, he does all these things the best, but within that, I'm going to take one slice of that and I'm going to become the best within that. Like this epic gardening show that you're talking about, within epic gardening, there's a slice that somebody could come out with, and I'm not going to like spout out what those possibilities could be, but they could become the best within the epic gardening niche.
Oh.
They're a niche within that niche.
And that exists, to your exact point.
Right.
There is someone who crushes orchids.
Orchids?
This is a sore subject. My wife and I got a few orchids. We can't keep the things alive, so we went down the rabbit. It's really a sad story.
Yeah.
Love our orchids until they die. And so there's a YouTube channel that has 1 million subscribers that is solely around. There's actually a technical scientific name for the practice of keeping taking care of orchids. They've gone super deep in that niche. And so, yeah, I think to your point, just like how can you crush your niche and be the best in it is the ideal thing. And one anecdote I would have is, again, people look at Morning Brew and look at it as the model. I don't think, especially for this crowd, if you're trying to create a newsletter for your company or a specific niche, I don't think Morning Brew should be the model. Because another way I think about content is there's basically 3 levels of content in terms of depth of content. Level 1 is super large addressable market, and it's generally harder to monetize the audience, or the lifetime value of your audience is lower. And so that content I would define as political content, pop culture content, sports content, general business news content. Level 2 content is where you start to get in the niches. So it's like at Morning Brew, we have retail brew, marketing brew, CFO brew, HR brew. So you get more niche. The value of every single subscriber is significantly higher. And then level 3 is like the super niches. So this would be if at Morning Brew, under our marketing brew franchise, we launched social media marketing brew or content marketing brew. Or for epic gardening, there's an orchid channel. And just to give you context of how much value is in the niches, for Morning Brew today, we have 4.5 million subscribers. Let's use the example of HR Brew. HR Brew, I want to say today has like 200,000 subscribers. We can charge almost as much for an advertiser to run in HR Brew to 200,000 subscribers as what we charge to get in front of 4.5 million subscribers for Morning Brew. And so to me, the goal for this audience isn't how do I create a great newsletter and get it to 2 million subscribers. It's actually how do I write a great newsletter, the best newsletter to help a CHRO succeed in their career. And I don't want 500,000 people. I only want 75,000 people, but I want them to be the 75,000 CHROs that work in the US. And if I just convert one of them every few newsletters, the investment in this newsletter has paid for itself.
And one thing I want to give you as an idea that you could do if you're kind of struggling to be like, well, what's that one niche that I could dominate, like the orchid idea? You could take 2 niches and combine them. And now by combining those 2 niches, you really have created a special niche of your own. And an example of that would be somebody's into yoga. And then you have a vegan over here, and they're doing their own thing. And you can't maybe be the top influencer on yoga or content creator in yoga, or the same with veganism. But what if you created the Yogi Vegan? And so now you've taken two niches, you combine them, and you better believe that every single vegan that now wants to get into yoga is going to probably be searching for yoga plus vegan, and they're gonna find you because you're dominating, you're owning that niche. And back to one of the things that you shared as we kind of end up winding down here is choosing hard mode. Please remember that the higher the barrier, the lower the competition. Like the reason why Entrepreneurs on Fire is still crushing it 12 years later, is still interviewing entrepreneurs 7 days a week, is because it's really hard to do what I do. Like it's really hard. So because of that, the barrier is so high, and that means the competition is so low. If it was easy what I did, as soon as I attained success, I would have had 1 million copycats that were doing basically the same thing, and then we all would have failed because nobody would have succeeded in that kind of environment. But because I went with such a high barrier of entry, made it so hard, I am dominating in that and continuing to do so because that barrier is so high, that competition stays so low. So how can you do that as an individual, as a business, as a company? How can you create that barrier to be so high? And maybe this is a good transition to continuing the conversation backstage.
Love it. I know we covered a lot of ground here in terms of like technically how to crush it with podcasts and newsletters. If you have any questions for John or I, we're going to be, what is it called again back there?
It's the HubSpot Media Creators Club. It's right behind us, literally.
We'll be there for a while, and we'll be taking any questions that anyone in the crowd has.
Yeah, so we're going to be walking right there, so you can just kind of walk right back over there. We're going to be sitting down, kind of in a setup like this, taking questions, any questions you have, specific answers. We're here for you. It's an open Q&A. Let's go have some fun.
Thank you guys so much. Appreciate the time.
Thank you.